This project seems almost as recklessly insane as building the National Railway. We are shooting a high-definition TV special as we ride the rail from Vancouver to Halifax. We want you to experience it. It's one of the great journeys in this world.
Woo-hoo, the whistle blows, all aboard, it's time to go. Roll, roll, the wheels go round, riding on the railway.
What makes it so memorable? Hi there. Is it the geography and the immensity of Canada? The history? All the people you meet on the train? Or the peaceful pace of travel?
So raise a glass for the engineer, riding on the railway, and all the railway riders here. Riding on the railway. The countryside we gaze upon, riding on the railway, and the silver rails we're riding on. Riding on the railway. Raise your glass again and say a toast to the crew aboard today. One for every old rail hand in the mighty trains of this mighty land. Woo-hoo, the whistle blows, all aboard, it's time to go. Roll, roll, the wheels go round, riding on the railway. Woo-hoo, the whistle blows, all aboard, it's time to go. Roll, roll, the wheels go round, riding on the railway. Riding on the railway, riding on the railway.
Join us for Canada's greatest ride. It's day 4 of my cross-country train trip, and we're still in Northern Ontario. It's a massive province that's nearly twice the size of France. The emptiness here is overwhelming. A book called The Great Lone Land that was written in 1872 described it this way. For 600 miles, there's stretched away to the northwest a vast tract of rock-fringed lake, swamp, and forest, lying spread in primeval savagery, an untraveled wilderness. And not much has changed. The rocks of the Canadian Shield are 500 million years old. You can understand why it took more than 20,000 men to get the track from here to the prairies. I'm trying to find out why this train journey across Canada is so extraordinary. Maybe it has something to do with this rugged land and resilient people. Sitting in the baggage car with Marlene. Now, how long have you been working for Via?
Going on 16 years now.
Now, you know, you've been, I guess, going back and forth then along this route, particularly the Northern Ontario wilderness land, for a long time. And you've got people you actually sort of look after and keep your eye out for.
We had one old guy that he was from Alsace, and he lived there and he had a dog, and he'd always get on, go to Folliette for his groceries, and then he'd always get on, and if the train would be a little late, I guess he'd go to the Folliette bar and have a few. And then for years, I guess he was used to, he had worked at CN at one point, I think, and before he retired, and he was in his 80s. I think when he passed away, old Bill, he was about 83 or 84. But he wouldn't leave. He wanted to sit in the baggage car with his dog. It had to be right.
You didn't take a seat?
I'd have to. I think a few of the conductors would finally tell him, "You gotta go and sit at that seat." But as soon as we'd start moving somewhere else, he'd be back in the baggage car right beside that dog.
Aww.
Yeah.
Well, you were saying too that, you know, you'll even gather up the newspapers that people bring on board and magazines and pop them off in Ottermere or some tiny little, you know.
Oh yeah, there's Ottermere, Malachi. There's quite a.
Well, and they'd be thrilled to get a newspaper, because otherwise they've got to schlep all the way to somewhere.
Yeah.
So you keep your eyes out for these people.
Yeah, they kind of, after a while, it's just, you know they're there, you know they love living where they live, and if you send them a little piece of free press or, you know.
Well, I mean, they're so isolated, really. I mean, that's the thing, really. Where we're going through, roads are, you know, they come, but it's a long ride. Marlene has seen all kinds of characters on this route, and she's certainly one herself. She's had lots of time over the years to think about the power of train travel. We've been talking endlessly, because we've had a lot of time here, about what makes this ride so great and Canada's greatest trip? Do you have any thoughts on that? Is it the scenery? Is it a history, people?
You know, if I get home and somebody puts a radio on, I get annoyed because I've been on the train for 4 days and it's peaceful. It's a beautiful, peaceful way of traveling.
A nice world unto itself. It certainly is a peaceful way to travel, and you don't have to do it in first class, which can cost anywhere from about $1,700 to $2,500 to go from one end of the country to the other, depending on the room and the season. But many people enjoy the ride in comfort class, which is Via's passenger service, and it's about half the price. They don't get the meals, they don't get the beds, but they get a blanket and a pillow, and they save a little bit of money on the way. But anyway, it's a different sort of experience. Tell me, where are you riding from?
I started in Vancouver, but I got off in Saskatoon, and then I got back on in Saskatoon, and I'm going to Montreal.
Oh, cool. So is this just to visit around, or how come you got on and off?
Well, my classes were over, and I'm going to visit my older sister and try to finish my homework.
So how is it sleeping on the train in the seats here?
You get used to it after a while. If nobody's snoring and there's no babies.
I was going to say, it must get really noisy sometimes, though.
It's okay. I tried to nap in the afternoon. It's a lot harder because people like to chat, but at nighttime people are pretty quiet. It's just people who snore, little, like, small babies, but you gotta be patient. It's, half the price of what you'd be paying for a room.
Price is one consideration, yeah, cheaper. Yeah, after flying a lot of bush planes to get in and out of these northern communities, I'd rather have my feet on the ground to say rather than take another plane, so.
And is it okay sitting up all that time, or do you think, oh, I wish I had a bed or something to lie out in, or someone serving me? Like they do, I can't tell you. They're serving us some very nice meals back in,
sure, yeah.
silver and blue class.
I'm sure it's pretty nice. Yeah, definitely the bed would be nice, but I'm not very tall, so the space isn't too bad. I can definitely curl up and still find a good night's sleep.
And you do get a decent sleep?
Yeah, pretty good.
It's interesting to hear all the different stories of where people have come from and where they're going. And it's symbolic of how and why the train stitched this country together. Another perfect example of that heritage is just ahead. Chris Tapanella, our resident railway expert, can't wait for the next stop and a reunion with the person who inspired his love of trains. At exactly 11:51 a.m., the train arrives in Pringle, Ontario, ahead of schedule. It's a railway divisional point and a distribution centre for the mining industry. The small community is being absorbed into the city of Sudbury. For Chris Tapanella, this is home. Although he lives in Toronto now, Pringle's where he grew up. Chris's mother and father live near here with his grandfather, from whom Chris inherited his love of trains. He knows a thing or two about trains, I gather. This is Henry Viberg, who's Chris Tapanella's grandfather. How old are you?
92.
92.
Plus.
Fabulous. So is that where he got this passion of his? Is it from you? Chris, is it from your grandfather?
Absolutely. From him and my uncle. And, my parents used to bring me to this very spot. I have photographic evidence. And I was right next to these cars. So, once it gets set in your mind, it's just, it's like magic.
Hold on, you better do an inspection here. What are you checking? Henry is an engineer who used to work for the company that built the truck, or the undercarriage of the trains. Some of his best memories are of riding the rails between Pringle and Winnipeg in a special car they used to test them. What is it? Was that your brand?
Yes.
Do you make this?
Yes.
You're kidding.
Yes. I didn't expect to see that.
Well, that makes me feel secure. I think the old railwaymen never die, is the fact. They just kind of keep on rolling or something.
It's really amazing.
Although Henry spent most of his life around trains, he hasn't been on the Canadian in 40 years. But today, Chris has arranged for him to ride from Pringle to Sudbury.
So maybe we'll get on at this point.
Whatever.
We'll get on here, we can have a look inside.
Oh yeah, that's the dome car.
Maybe you want to see a dome car.
Yeah. Well, they had these when Betty and I went to class, you know.
Oh, did they?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we sat up here.
Which seat did you sit in?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, you can have
Yeah,
a seat.
Betty and I think we were sitting in one when we got into Winnipeg.
There you
A
go.
long time ago.
Just before 1 p.m., right on schedule, we are once again heading east on our way to Halifax. It is so touching to see the connection between grandfather and grandson, and how proud they are of each other and how insanely passionate they are about trains. This is an experience they'll never forget, even if it doesn't last very long.
I think too, it's all welded track now, eh? Remember in my day it wasn't.
So what happened in your day?
Well, they were held together by joint bars. You know? Originally the track length was only 39 feet because they're governed by the length of a flat car, which is 40 feet.
Oh.
So the rail couldn't be any longer than 39 feet.
And why couldn't it be longer than one flat car?
Well, they'd have to put it from one car over to the other, and then you got trouble negotiating curve.
Only 20 minutes after leaving Cape Reel, we reach Sudbury Junction.
That's the quickest drive you've ever had to Sudbury.
Yeah, sure.
Just turn as you're getting off, sir.
It's here that Chris must say goodbye to his grandfather. We've witnessed so many instances on this trip of how the train becomes part of families' lives. Generations work on the trains and keep the traditions alive. As a passenger who's just passing through, you really see that and respect it.
And I'll be on my way and we'll see each other soon.
Did you see the look on Henry's face when he saw who built the undercarriage of that train? I'm going to be that excited when I see Georgian Bay. The landscape here is starting to get very familiar to me, which is pretty exciting considering you come so far across the country, and now it's sort of, looking and smelling a lot like home. We just passed over the French River. My parents honeymooned there, but it was part of a historic fur trading route. And pretty shortly we're going to be down around Parry Sound, approaching Georgian Bay. Parry Sound, home of Bobby Orr, gateway to the 30,000 islands, which I didn't realize is the largest concentration of islands in the entire world. Georgian Bay is one of the most beautiful places on this planet. But we still have a way to go before we get there, through some of the most formidable rock and muskeg of northern Ontario. Carving a path through the Canadian Shield is no easy task, even today. Imagine what it was like when they built the railway more than 120 years ago. It's been more than 24 hours since we crossed the border into Ontario, and we still haven't seen many signs of civilization. It's incredible how truly massive this province is, and it's not hard to see what they were up against when they built this railway. First of all, let me just ask you, how great was it to see your grandfather?
Oh, it was great to see him and my mom and dad, and actually roll through, which was about 10 miles from my childhood home. So, and it's neat to see it from the train perspective.
Now, coming through Ontario, which is endless. I mean, everybody obviously talks about the Selkirks and the engineering marvel of the railway trestles through the Rockies and the mountains. Getting through Ontario, especially northern Ontario, was horrendous for the people who built the railway.
Well, these are the exposed rocks here, some of the oldest in the world. You have rock that juts right out of the ground. It was carved by glaciers, and then all of a sudden you have long tracts of swamp muskeg that has no solid support underneath. So they're trying to put a solid railroad that's not going to sink right through a swamp. And you can imagine back then they didn't have the heavy equipment that we have now to move rock around and fill. And what would happen was they need a lot of manpower to fill and fill and fill and fill until they get a nice crest that would be the foundation for the railroad.
Well, I remember reading something like White River to Thunder Bay was just one of the nightmares of engineering, and that they'd lay track and it would just about kill them, and then it would disappear.
Yeah,
I mean, next day you'd come back, it wasn't even there.
I've actually heard of it even happening recently on a remote line somewhere else. It still happens today. Probably not on this line because it's been used for so long.
I remember, again, being up in Armstrong, fishing, float plane had taken me out, middle of nowhere in the boreal forest, and hearing a train go by, and that's about the route we take, comes by Armstrong. You're thinking, how would they get train tracks through here?
Well, it's just they have a train that continues on as far as the tracks go, and then they unload equipment constantly. The work gang usually would have stayed out there for extended periods, and they just keep picking away, and most of it really was filling these areas, and then also having to construct trestles and bridges, often curved, on between two big rocks that are hopefully solid enough to support everything.
But is it still hard to maintain? Because I swore last night as we hurtled past Long Lac and wherever we were while I was trying to sleep, that it was really, the train was shaking away. My door flew open at one point, something fell over. Is it rougher terrain around there?
I would guess, just from what I've seen, is that I've seen a lot more work trains in this area, and they must do a lot more work here, especially in the summertime. They're probably gearing up to add more fill, add more ballast, and check the gauge on all the tracks.
You know what I think they should do is they should make CPR freight get off there. I mean, because the freight trains go right along the shore of Lake Superior. I remember the first time I took this train, I was so disappointed not to see Lake Superior. I just wanted to get a glimpse of it even. But, this train cuts much further north up by Sudbury and Armstrong. So why can't you get them to fix that? You're the freight train expert.
I don't know, I wish. I mean, they probably do. I guess one problem with it, though, is that then you're cutting off a lot of communities up north. So it's an interesting question. We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, well, I know. I just wanted to see Lake Superior. Anyway, it is really an interesting thing to see how huge this is and how difficult it was for them to create. Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome.
Okay, just to prove that we're not just complete homers by saying that the Trans-Canada Railway experience is one of the great rides on the planet, I just have a little evidence here, Exhibit A and Exhibit B. This book, I don't know if you've seen, Great Journeys of the World from National Geographic, and it talks about crossing Europe on the Orient Express, on safari in East Africa, crossing the mighty Yangtze River, a trip through Rajasthan, and traveling Canada's transcontinental railway, written by a fellow named Thurston Clark. And it starts off saying, Canadians are a great people for superlatives, fond of boasting about having the longest coastline, the highest tides, the biggest bay, and, after Russia, of being the largest country on the earth. After traveling almost 4,000 miles across this country, and after dangling one foot in the Atlantic at Halifax, and 2 weeks and 2 changes of train later, the other in the Pacific at Vancouver, I'm ready to argue for a new superlative. If you believe, as I do, that there is something inherently exotic about sheer size, then a journey by train across Canada makes it seem like one of the most exotic nations on earth. Now, another book you probably see, I see this everywhere, 1,000 Places to See Before You Die. Now, that's a little larger of a list to make. It's not one of 8, it's one of 1,000, but here we are again. One of the great things to do, the Canadian Rockies by train. So, anyway, there you go. Those are two authorities I'm going to quote to say we're not just, tooting our own horn to say that this is Canada's greatest ride. The train arrives in Parry Sound, a town of about 7,000 people on Georgian Bay. It was named after Arctic explorer Sir William Parry, and it has the world's deepest freshwater port. And it's also the hometown of NHL legend Bobby Orr, as well as the gateway to the famous 30,000 Islands. But we're not here for long. There's still lots of track to cover before our next major stop in Toronto. For engineer Bill Bean, it's track well traveled.
We're going to clear the stop on the home signal folding via number 2, yellow. Yeah. We hold the main line here. The freight train is going to take the siding for us, so we'll proceed to the south end until we get a permissive signal.
The VIA engineers on the Canadian are among the most experienced in the country, and many of them have spent years driving freight trains.
We've just received our approach signal to the siding faulting, and we're going to be meeting a CN freight train here, train 103.
Like other engineers, Bill has seen many changes over the years. Among them, the virtual disappearance of the caboose, a railway icon. As the last car on the freight train, the caboose was where workers would supervise the train from the rear to prevent it from separating and applying brakes when needed. These days, it's all done electronically.
There's the end. You'll see, if you get a look, you might see the end of his train. It's got what they call an end of train unit. Look down near the back end if you can, Brian. Yep. I guess you won't see it. That's what replaced the caboose. I don't know if you got to...
It's not quite the same, eh?
Yeah, it's not the same for sure. Clear signal on the home at Medora via number 23. That's Kenny Gunn. One thing I will say that over the course of time, there's been some real dramatic changes even at VIA. Like at one time there was 5 or 6 employees here in the actual operation of the train itself. I'm not talking about onboard service people, I'm talking about people that are handling the operation of the train. Whereas when you think of it today, the operational end is handled by 2 engineers only. There's no conductors, no brakemen, no baggagemen, no flagmen. Your 2 engineers have got the sole responsibility in the operational end of your train. So when you have 30 coaches, which we sometimes get here on our train, it's a real responsibility that you carry. So things like that, you got to learn to adapt and move with change, and it's a sign of the times. It's changing times we live in.
Even though times have changed, there are still people who have trains in their blood. I'm sitting here in comfort class with John Wilson. Where'd you get on the train?
In Vancouver.
In Vancouver. You see, you've been sitting in these chairs the whole way? Oh, you're a tougher man than I am. How'd you sleep? Because we're almost in Toronto now. This is 3 nights.
A person can make a very good bed out of them.
Can you? You just go back.
These footrests and use the pillows for as a pillow and the blanket. Make a nice little bed out of them. Not a little short.
You're a former CN employee?
Yes.
For how many years?
Oh, 27 years about. I got a buyout in 1991.
Really? So what did you do?
I was conductor.
Where?
Halifax, Moncton, Hamilton.
Oh, really? We're heading there.
Yes.
It's a nice run, eh?
Familiar run.
I'm sure. Now, do they have conductors anymore?
Not on passenger trains, but they do on freight trains.
What does a conductor do, or what did the conductor do?
He or she is engaged primarily in protection of the train, because the driver, all his attention is required for driving.
So everything else would be the conductor. So what's that job called now?
Well, I think, as far as I know, there's conductors on freight trains. But now, on passenger trains, there are no conductors. The second engineer, one of them, he or she acts as the conductor.
Now, what are you doing on the train?
Well, I find it relaxing, and I travel free.
Well, that would be appealing. So you got a pass.
Yes, I get away from problems. I remember a fellow employee saying one time, and when he gets down in the dumps or depressed, he gets on a plane and goes to Scotland. Well, I get on a train and I go to Saskatoon to visit some friends or something.
How often do you do that?
You'll be surprised.
What surprised me?
Well, I was called into the Pass Bureau one time, and they, don't misunderstand me, she laughed and said, hope you're enjoying your retirement. But they were wondering, they were just curious, well, how a person could make 190 trips in 1 year. I was a little bit surprised myself. Look, they would be looking for...
You're just using it like your own personal
they
subway
suspected,
system.
Yeah, maybe fraud, that I was selling it or something.
So do you end up talking to a lot of people on the train? Because part of the fun, a lot of people say, is, you know, meeting people from all over the world or just having conversations, like real conversations.
Well, I find with the lounge car, not where alcohol is not served in a specific place, and with the smoking ban, people have lost their commonality. Quite often, one would go into the lounge car and have a drink or have a cigarette, whatever, for better or for worse, one had something in common with these people. But now people don't go in the lounge car for any particular purpose, and it doesn't seem to be quite so chummy as it used to be.
But it's a nice pace of travel, isn't it?
Yeah, and time is not important to me. It reminds me of the old Canard slogan. They had, getting there is half the fun.
As we head southeast, what was countryside and Canadian Shield is now the suburbs and urban sprawl of southern Ontario. The labyrinth of cities, towns, and bedroom communities around Toronto represent the most developed and populated part of the country. But as we get closer to Canada's biggest city, something surprising happens. We go from parking lots and pavement to rivers and ravines, a perspective you only get riding the rails. Although our journey is far from over, the first leg of our trip has now come to an end. We had a gorgeous green ride all the way down the Don Valley into Toronto. It didn't seem like a big city. I mean, kids were playing soccer, there were golf courses, and then all of a sudden you find you're right downtown in the heart of it all at Union Station, this magnificent building, which was opened August 6, 1927, replacing the old train station. But it was a huge event. They had Edward the Prince of Wales here, his brother Prince George, father of Queen Elizabeth. The British Prime Minister was here, Stanley Baldwin, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King, all here for the grand opening. They presented the Prince of Wales with a ticket to Alberta. He had a ranch out there, cost $71.20. I think probably $1,200 in today's money that would cost. But this is really one of the final structures of the golden era of railways. It's seen people come and go to World War II, the scene of so many events in this city's history, and is a grand old building that was threatened to be torn down in the name of progress at one point in the 60s when people were idiots and thought all buildings should be big boxes. Thank God people had enough sense to save this building. So it remains the hub of rail transportation and local commuter traffic as well in Toronto. Union Station in Toronto was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Grand Trunk Railway. It was officially opened in 1927 as a modern temple of transportation, and it was saved from the Wreckers Ball a couple of decades ago. It is the busiest transportation hub in the country, busier than any Canadian airport, and it connects commuter trains and freight trains with Toronto's subway system and Via Rail's passenger service. Now, after a day off in Toronto, I'm ready to start the second leg of our journey. But first, I have to say goodbye to Chris Tapanella. Hello, Mr. Chris. So you're not coming with us any further. How will I know anything?
Well, you're going to have these guys with you. We're lucky we got some rail fans to come on the train.
I see you brought some rail buff.
And you know, I'm really jealous of them because I got to stay here and actually do some work for a change.
I see they're almost as crazy, if not crazier than you.
Yeah, is it the look in the eye or what? You know, it's just a little bit distant, far away, glazed over thing.
That's funny. Well, so these guys will come with me and tell me all about trains?
Oh yeah, they'll tell you more than I did.
Hi, I'm Valerie.
Nice to meet you.
Hello. So let's go. Let's get on. Okay. Look, there he is. Chris. The route we are now traveling is called the Corridor. It's the busiest section of track in the country, and it runs from Windsor, Ontario to Quebec City. While many people take the train purely for pleasure, most of the people here are commuting, a practical way of avoiding the gridlock of Toronto. One thing you may have noticed is we've changed trains. But as you can see, this is really a different kind of train than we were taking, you know, through the Rockies or whatever on the Canadian. This is called the Corridor. So fundamentally, Toronto-Montreal. Also, this one I think ends up going up to Ottawa, but this is the most populated part of the country. I mean, it's hugely populated, and this is kind of a commuter train. So this is first class, so it's pretty snappy, and they'll serve us a nice meal, etc. But you know, not that different from the seats all the way back. But you know, there's internet access. People are on phones. This is, you know, a completely viable alternative for people who don't want to drive or fly to Montreal. They can just hop on this, and you know, generally 4 hours, something like that. It's very comfy. We've come all the way from Vancouver, and for most of our route across the country, there is only one track, a ribbon of steel across the land. But here, in this very heavily populated part of the country, there are way more tracks and stops, at least 8 between Toronto and Montreal, which is our next destination. Okay, we're in comfort class now, just wandering. I see a familiar face here. This woman goes to my exercise class.
Very good.
So, can I ask you about taking the train and the appeal of this, or why you do this instead of drive or fly or whatever?
It's cheaper.
Yeah.
And we're staying at a hotel in Montreal right at the train station, so it's very convenient.
Yeah.
We're going to a conference.
You too?
Yeah, I like the train. I like the sound of the whistle. It's an old, familiar sound. It's very comforting, and it's more comfortable than an airplane. I can get up and move around a lot more, so I'm actually enjoying it a lot more than a plane.
It is very nice, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Well, thank you for being so cooperative. Riding the rails across the country, I've met many people who are passionate about trains, but there is a group of people who take it to a whole other level. They are rail fans. They refer to themselves as foamers. Searching for some railway Oh, you must be the insane railway fans. The rail fans. How are you? Hi,
Nice
we
to
haven't
meet you.
met. I've met Russ and Jason. How are you? Now, I thought we'd just chat about trains, and I'll try and catch you on my.
Sure.
Okay, foamer.
Foamer, yeah.
Explain.
Well, I think foamer is basically as you'd think. You know, a lot of rail fans, they get a little excited when they see a particular type of
Foaming at
train,
the
and
mouth.
they're foaming at the mouth, basically.
So people like you are called foamers. Now, have you ever called in sick to go watch trains?
No, I haven't done that. I usually got permission from the boss, and he gave me a day off. He was a rail fan too. I think there's a whole bunch of sides to rail fanning. I'd say over 90% of rail fans are photographers as well. There's a lot of railway pictures on the internet. I think a lot of rail fans are history buffs as well and concerned about preserving railway history, getting involved with railway museums.
Well, one of the things we've been talking about as we've come across the country is, you know, the appeal of train travel. Is it anachronistic? Is it just sort of nostalgia? Or is it, you know, is there something to it right now that does make it different, better than any other way to go across Canada?
Oh, I think so, definitely. I don't think I've ever been as proud to be a Canadian as when I rode the train across Canada for the first time. The people that you meet from the different parts of the country, great pride in the geography of the country and our culture and our heritage. I think it's all grouped into being a rail fan. There's different types of rail fans, as you can see.
Here's another thing. For example, both Jason and I are on the board of directors of the Toronto Railway Historical Association, and our mission is to take part of Union Station and part of the roundhouse down there and turn it into a railway heritage center so that people appreciate what the railways did for the country. And we're very actively working towards creating that in the next few years.
You must have people who look at you, like perhaps me, and think, it's swell, happy to take the ride. Very happy to take the ride. Can't imagine taking pictures of trains, going on the websites, you know, being that passionate about the train.
Yeah, I think it's a hobby for a lot of people, I think, yeah.
I think each of us has different passions. Some people have a passion for golf, some people have a passion for art, which is wonderful. And we have passions for mechanical monsters that do these incredible things for people. And that's what drives us. And it's just gets us very, very excited. It's been very, very exciting to be a rail fan and a model railroader and all that sort of stuff.
Well, I've turned it from a hobby and a passion into a career, actually. And I started a company last year called Rapido Trains Incorporated, www.rapidotrains.com. And my goal was to build models, manufacture models of Canadian trains. And this here is a model kit of the train we're riding on. It's called the LRC, Light, Rapid, Comfortable. And it was built for Via Rail in the early 80s by Bombardier. And because the Canadian market's so small, none of the American manufacturers ever produced a model of it. So I said, well, this is a problem. And I started this company, and this has been very widely received, and I'm actually able to feed my wife, which is wonderful.
Well, I'm obviously way out of my league here, but I've loved talking to you. You guys are a riot. You're just great. But I'll head back to my seat now. Have fun on your ride. I had a pair of those overalls, but it was when I was pregnant. I found them very comfy. I don't think I have them anymore. Never had the hat, though.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Time sure flies when you're talking to foamers. Their passion and sense of humor keeps them young at heart. Just imagine what it must be like for a kid on the train for the first time. About an hour after leaving Toronto, we arrive in Oshawa, a city of 150,000 on the shores of Lake Ontario, in one of the many commuter stations between Toronto and Montreal. And it's here we say goodbye to our friends, the foamers.
See you guys.
I'll bet their love of trains began when they were children. Have you ever been on a train before, like a real train?
Yep.
Which one? Was like a subway or this?
Actually, my next trip was just being on this train.
What do you think?
It's good.
Yeah?
I like it.
You're sort of wiggly.
I know.
But is the train making you wiggle, or are you wiggling all on your own?
The train.
What do you like about this?
That we get to go back and see all the houses.
That's right. And you can see, sometimes you can see the lake.
Yeah. And you can see farms.
Is it comfy?
Yeah.
So are you going to sleep on the train?
Yeah.
How fun is that? You can have breakfast on a train?
Wow. Cool.
Cool. You can have lunch on a train and dinner on a train.
Wow.
You can live on a train. Did you ever go to Montreal before?
No.
Wow. Have you ever been to Halifax before?
No. I'm going there.
I know. You're going to go see the ocean?
Yeah.
The Atlantic Ocean you're going to see?
Yeah.
It's so amazing the places you can go, the things you can see. Haley's enthusiasm for the train is infectious, but you know what? Train seems to bring out the inner child in almost everyone. Such a drag when you lose the diamonds. Look, there's another train, freight train. It'll have a little orange caboose at the end.
It will?
Yeah, it did. Went by really fast. It's nice to see all the things where people live. Sometimes you see the cows. When we came across the other part of the country, we saw mountains, huge rivers, Then we saw prairies and farms for miles and miles, and then all sorts of lakes, millions of lakes, and pine trees, and beaver dams. And now it's pretty farmland. It's really nice. Do you like the whistle?
Yeah.
Heading east to Montreal, we pass through Port Hope, a town of 17,000. And although we don't see much from the train, Port Hope is one of the best preserved 19th century communities in Ontario. It's lovely. And it's only one of the highlights in this region, which is rich with history. It's beautiful country here, a lot of southeastern Ontario. We're just going by an area known as Prince Edward County, which is booming. It's sort of the new hot Niagara place. There are vineyards springing up there. It's its own little microclimate, and it is the cool destination with Sandbanks Provincial Park and that sort of thing. Prince Edward County was one of the first places where the United Empire Loyalists settled in Ontario after the American Revolution. They also migrated to our next stop, but I'm more interested in its connection to the railway. We're just about to pull into Kingston, Ontario, the ancient capital of the United Provinces of Canada before Confederation. But it's also the home of Sir John A. Macdonald. You know, he lived there. And I guess, was seen as the father of the railway. He's the one who promised it to BC and pushed it through and weathered scandals and came up with the money and dealt with all those things. But I was just reading this quote from him that I'd written down saying, late events have shown us that we are made one people by that road, that iron link has bound us together in such a way that we stand superior to most of the shafts of ill fortune. 19th century, but and that's true. That iron road has bound us together, and it did create us, and that's it is part of the appeal of this, the history of it, and seeing how the country grew and developed. I mean, the line we're on is 150 years old, the same sort of link between Toronto and Montreal, Kingston. It's a pretty city, very pretty city. The pastoral scenery of eastern Ontario and Quebec along the St. Lawrence is lovely and completely different from anything we've seen in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. But I'm thinking about history again. I think you can't help it when you're riding the train in this country, because the railway changed the lives of millions of Canadians by carrying them west, or to war, or to work, or home, and in doing so, changed the face of Canada. This is really an old bit of track that we're rolling along here, built by Grand Trunk. It was created, this corridor, the rail between Toronto and Montreal, by an act of Parliament, 1852, in Canada. In Canada then was just Ontario and Quebec. In fact, it was so English, I guess, when they built the double track system. It's been in operation since 1856. For, I guess, first 40 years of its operation, they drove on the left-hand side as they do in England. But we are almost in Quebec, which is sort of mind-boggling because it feels like we, passed that Manitoba-Ontario border about 25 days ago. In fact, it was several days ago, but the province of Ontario is so huge to go through. And we did have a stop in Toronto, and then we hopped on the train to Montreal today, take this zippy corridor express, and we've traveled every inch of it. And we've met many characters along the way, like Chris Tapinella's grandfather Henry, who used to build trains. John Wilson, the retired conductor who rides the rails to get away from it all. And the foamers! And Haley, a future rail fan. At 2:30 in the afternoon, we arrive in Montreal, more than 5 hours after leaving Toronto, and more than 4 days since we left Vancouver on the west coast. Montreal is a major milestone on our journey. It was from here on the 28th of June in 1886 the Pacific Express departed for British Columbia. That was the first scheduled Trans-Canada rail trip and the longest in the world at the time. Montreal is a spectacular city. It's a great place to spend a few hours before the final leg of our cross-country journey to the Atlantic Ocean.
the whistle blows, all aboard, it's time to go. Roll, roll, the wheels go round, riding on the railway. Well, a guy gets on in Halifax, riding on the railway. Says, here I go, boys, down the tracks. Riding on the railway. By God, I'll miss the family, riding on the railway. But there's something out there calling me, riding on the railway. So raise a glass for the engineer, riding on the railway. And all the railway riders here, riding on the railway. The countryside we gaze upon, riding on the railway. And the silver rails we're riding on, riding on the railway. Raise your glass again and say a toast to the crew aboard today. One for every old rail hand in the mighty trains of this mighty land. Woo-hoo, the whistle blows, all aboard, it's time to go. Roll, roll, the wheels go round, riding on the railway. Woo-hoo, the whistle blows, all aboard, it's time to go. Roll, roll, the wheels go round, riding on the railway, riding on the railway, riding on the